I'm Leslie Demai, and welcome to our monthly live lecture inside the School of Mysticism, Walking the Enlightened Path, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Let's get started on who Patanjali was and what are the sutras. We are then going to get an in-depth breakdown of the Eightfold Path that is also known as Ashtanga Yoga. But for now, we are going to take a look at how the sutras are not only a blueprint for the spiritual seeker, for spiritual liberation, they are a map that will guide you to samadhi or enlightenment. The route you take is the one you choose. Ultimately, the only way to get there is by taking the steps needed, which is why you must walk the path. It's not talking the talk, it's about walking the walk. And sometimes walking the walk is having to practice renunciation, having to detach yourself, not only from everything you've ever thought you've known, but a lot of what you have come to get used to doing. People like to learn about spiritual practices, ancient texts such as the sutras, but how many are willing to actually take the first step, the second step, the third step, the fourth step on the path? Even if it's not always illuminated, even if it's not always a clear path, even if you trip, even if you get lost, how many times do you get back on the path? And so this lecture is for those of you who time and time again take a stride forward and start to figure this out really. How do we really get to a place of spiritual liberation? So Patanjali lived between the 2nd and 4th century CE. For us to even be speaking of his writings, he had to have been such an incredibly evolved soul, and he chose to incarnate to aid humanity. And we'll talk about that. There's a lot of myth and folklore around Patanjali and who he actually was. Some say that there was more than one Patanjali that wrote these sutras. And yeah, so we will talk about that a little bit, but let's move on here. In his Yoga Sutras, he outlined a blueprint of 196 aphorisms that included all of life's facets, spiritual facets. And they're designed to overcome bodily ailments and mental fluctuations, ultimately for the purpose to attain samadhi or enlightenment. Whether you reach it or not, whether it takes you lifetimes, if you put into practice these sutras or sutures, that's another translation, a root word for suture or thread. If you thread these pieces, if you thread this gnosis, you can create something of real relevance. You can create that incredible infinite geometrical shape that just is in perfect resonance. Not only bringing you closer to a higher state of consciousness, but ridding yourself of old baggage, ridding yourself of samskaras or karmic imprints or ancestral imprints that are still in your DNA, or these mental fluctuations that limit us, or external forces impeding in our energy and trying to take hold of one's fate. One can then lessen that impact. The sutra or the suture or the thread is weaving that all back together. And sometimes when you've got a hot mess going on, you've got to unstitch some things and you've got to say no to a lot of things. And so I feel that in the age that we are in now, it takes even more effort to do that, because now we have so many more options that a lot of people are not aware of all of the distractions they are immersing themselves in, to not even have an idea of the mental fluctuations that are inhabiting them. So you can't even really get to that aspect of yoga because you have been immersed in the collective. You have been immersed in the Maya. And so you have your routines of doing things. And it could be working out for you because the fact that you have these schedules and interactions with the collective, and maybe for individuals who work for corporations or companies, or they have bosses that they're not in alignment with, and it's not necessarily someone living their dharma. All of that is really preventing you from allowing things to come to the surface. And there's a quote that actually fits in perfectly with all of this. And this is from BKS Iyengar, who has his interpretations of the Yoga Sutras. So these aphorisms are very short. They're like a cue card for something grander and more in depth. So when you have a cue card and you're studying something, you just put in the few keywords, and then you're able to like, oh, I remember the whole picture later. You don't write everything down. And so that's what these aphorisms are. And so there are many interpretations of them. One of the authors is BKS Iyengar. I have been familiar with him for many years. I have read his books. A lot of the interpretations of these aphorisms and translations, because they were written in Sanskrit, a lot of these translations are going to be coming from Iyengar's perspective. And here's his book, Light on Yoga, Sutras of Patanjali. And here's a quote. This is going to help clarify a little bit what yoga actually is. If you are still under the perspective that yoga is something that you do in a class with other people that you have to pay like $15 to get into, and you got to have the gear, and you know, some people are really, really good at doing handstands and all that. That is an inversion. That has been the inversion of Western society, hiding the truth from people, giving them just enough to make them think that they're doing something spiritual, but hiding the truth, concealing the truth, and then making it really shiny with a consumer-driven archetype or persona or subculture. And then people riding that train and thinking that, hey, I've done my part. I went to my yoga class. But it is so much more than that. That just actually becomes another distraction, keeping you from really understanding what's going on internally, and keeping you from understanding like who you really are and what sim character you've been playing, and how you can go back to your original state and re-immerse yourself with your true state. And doing it all while being a human in this incarnation. Now, you might not reach enlightenment, and for some, that might not even be the goal. Many people just want to live a peaceful life. Many people want to live an independent life. Many people want to create their own reality. But how do we start? How do we get there? So it's time to really reflect upon what your ultimate goal is. If you're going to walk the walk, you got to know the destination. And so that's what this path is, and that's what these aphorisms are in this blueprint. It's like a map. And how you get to the destination is going to be different than how I get there. But we do have a map, and we have key points to help guide us. So back to the quote. Together, Patanjali's 3 works deal with man's development as a whole, in thought, speech, and action. His treatise on yoga is called Yoga Darshana. Darshana means vision of the soul and also mirror. The effect of yoga is to reflect the thoughts and actions of the aspirant as in a mirror. The practitioner observes the reflections of his thoughts, mind, and consciousness and actions and corrects himself. This process guides him towards the observation of his inner self. So precisely the point I was trying to make here is that the reason why it has been exceptionally more difficult for people to even get to a place to actually begin to look in the mirror is because of all the distractions. There are so many now. And so in the beginning of the sutras, Patanjali does speak a lot about renunciation and non-attachment. And that can seem pretty advanced to people to think, okay, so I have to give this up. Like, where am I going to start? I might as well not even start. I don't know where to start. But that is because you got to clip things off completely in order to even get the opportunity to truly reflect on yourself. And in modern society in the West, like what we think that is sometimes is taking 5 days to do a retreat in the woods or somewhere in nature. And yeah, you'll get some time to reflect and you'll get some pages written out in your journal and you'll take some yoga classes or whatever else you like to do in nature. But this walking the path takes consistency and it takes complete devotion. How devoted are you to this? And so these sutras are for the spiritual liberation of one's self. And we can really reflect on what that looks like for us today now. I'm sure the world was much different when Patanjali was around, but the purpose is still the same. And that gives us a nice foundation and secures us a path to begin to walk the walk. So in that quote, B.K.S. Iyengar mentioned that Patanjali's 3 works, okay, these would be writings he authored. What he wrote about besides yoga, which is what we're going to talk about, he wrote on grammar. He has these texts on grammar, and if you think about it, mastery of grammar, it was seen as essential, not only to communicate effectively, but also for the interpretations of sacred texts. So we're talking about the Vedas, the Upanishads. He was helping humanity with, quote, grammar so that they could not only absorb and comprehend other sacred texts, but also words or spells. And with affirmations and mantras, you got to perfect the pronunciation of the mantra and you got to perfect the words in your affirmations in order to find some congruency and the ability to propel yourself in that path as well. So mastery of grammar was absolutely essential to the scholars and those seeking spiritual liberation. Now, he also wrote about medicine and Ayurveda. So he was also coming at this with a total holistic approach for man. And his dharma was to provide mankind a complete holistic map. And that's what it is to walk the enlightened path. That's what it's about. We can use some direction. Okay, we need something, some guidance. It's not just about memorizing the sutras. And that's why I find these fascinating, because it's not just about memorizing something. They're literally like rules and templates. And when I say rules, it's basically much more profound than just saying a rule. Like, you can't jump off the diving board after 6 p.m. or you must have the lights off by 10 p.m. These are like cosmic rules, but for the cosmic being incarnated in earth. Yeah, they're aphorisms for the divine spark to remember the way back. So in his 196 aphorisms in the Yoga Sutras, there have been many interpretations of them by different authors from different times. And so, like I said, I'm sticking to B.K.S. Iyengar's interpretation. I did a lot of other research, and when I studied these sutras myself years ago, when I was practicing in India and doing the Eightfold Path, I studied Ashtanga Yoga And Ashtanga yoga is actually what we're going to be focusing on today. There's still some real relevance here. And it seems like the spiritual beings are more interested in living like our ancient ancestors did, more so than buying into what's been sold to the public and what we've been sold in this reality. And so we are in the reset. Many of us are resetting, rewiring, rebooting in order to get into our own reality and to pull away and to rip out the leeches, that type of energy, to escape out of that paradigm that you find yourself in. And so where does that lead us? It leads many of us to turn away from modern society. Doesn't mean we're turning away from modern tools or certain conveniences, but we are definitely doing everything to pull away from the collective and learning how to evolve past that. And that takes us back to who we used to be prior to all of this mess. People living on the earth in harmony, co-creating with the earth. And it can be anything, learning how to grow your own food, refusing to be poisoned every meal, refusing to breathe in the poisonous air, and seeking a place for one to really have an opportunity at this. So whether your goal is spiritual enlightenment, or whether your goal is just to find some more peace and mastery over the mind and emotions, that's something you want to also reflect on once we start going over the Eightfold Path, those sutras in particular. So yeah, in a sense, this is the reset. The collective is evolving right along the AI and the mainstream agendas, the vast majority. And then the rest of us are resetting. There's been an extraction there. And maybe that's your goal. Maybe you want to extract yourself from that. And so once you're living that and you're walking that, you see, wow, yeah, there's been a reset. This ain't the same place as it was when Patanjali was here. And so that's why we come back to this thousands of years later. And now it is more so relevant than ever because of that, because of all of the distractions and the different paths that are available now. So many paths, so many subcultures you can subscribe to, so many digital platforms, so much going on. It's like Vegas in your hand at all times. And so Patanjali talks about renunciation and how to master that, how to not do something, basically, and how to not be attached, non-attachment. So those two things are going to be that much more of a journey. There are still some of us that are interested in learning and passing on the gnosis from these avatars and sages from thousands of years ago. Like, who are we? That means something. That is something you should feel thoroughly. That means something. That's likely a part of your dharma, of why you're here. And although we are the minority, that does not mean we have been forgotten. And it does not mean that we don't have tools. So today, you will find some relevance in these texts and you will find some direction. But what you likely won't find here is a single sutra that's going to solve all of your problems. That's the thing. It's a map, right? So there's different ways to get there. And however you get there is your unique formula. So you're not just following some rules that's A to B to C to D to E. That's the thing about the Yoga Sutras. Some of you might not be ready for B, and maybe you're on C already and you've already mastered D, but you're willing to work on A. Whereas for someone else, it's completely different. And these sutras, although they're short and concise, as I had mentioned, they're like a bullet point for a grander, more expanded, thorough subject. You could spend your entire life working on just one or two. Now, don't let that discourage you. That's not to discourage you. It's just to show you how deep this really is. And so I hope you approach this with an open mind, because some of these sutras might sound familiar to you, but understand there is so much more depth than what you've been sold when it comes to yoga. So the Yoga Sutras are divided into 4 chapters, or padas, meaning parts or quarters. Sadhana pada, on practice, is where we're going to find the portion on the Eightfold Path, Ashtanga Yoga, the yamas and niyamas. So number 2 is where we're going to really be focusing on. And to the right, we have pages from a manuscript. It's written in Sanskrit. And yeah, it's pretty interesting to see that they have some evidence with the commentary on that. So that's like an ancient translation and interpretation of the sutras. And here we have some imagery of Patanjali. So his birth is surrounded by mythical stories. And one story is about him falling from the heavens in the form of a snake. And he's an incarnation of a serpent king, Adi Shehesha, the primordial serpent king. So he's a Naga. And Nagas have been worshipped by people all over, from ancient India, Southeast Asia, the Chinese, the Sumerian, the Akkadian, the Aztecs, the Greeks and Roman mythology as well mention it. So, they're often associated with bringing in technologies and sciences and evolution for humanity. Now, the motives could differ, but that would be for another discussion. But in yoga, the serpent is symbolic for Kundalini, and his depiction of half serpent, half man is indicative of his ability to master over duality. So he is an incarnation of yoga itself. And this is how he was able to understand human nature so profoundly. He really wanted to be here, and he really wanted to create this impact. And, he sought out from Vishnu. And also we're going to talk a little bit about Lord Shiva. And so he wanted to create this impact for humanity, for the betterment of humanity. There's a quote, and it says, "He did not leave anything for anyone to say about life." And that means basically he covered it all. And that goes for the gods too. So some would even rival his influence for the betterment of humanity and what he's covered, and his ability and his intellect and his just vast comprehension might rival it with God's as well. Patanjali is also known as the father of yoga. He is a pioneer of contemporary yoga, even though it's, it may not seem contemporary. Yoga was around prior to him. And he didn't originate the practice itself. It existed in different facets prior. But the first yogi is Shiva. He is also known as Adi Yogi, the first yogi. And he is one of the most important gods in Hinduism. He's a member of the Holy Trinity, which is Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. And Vishnu said, without yoga Shiva can't be experienced. Shiva imparted yoga to 7 sages. He definitely possessed deep understanding of human nature and all of this, but he didn't document it. And so he is quite a force. And so when you're quite a force, it's not necessarily your job to sit there and be a scribe. So he assigned it to 7 sages. And this was an attempt to transmit his vast knowledge to, it couldn't just be one person because it's vast knowledge. So to 7 people. And those 7 sages then created the writings and the disciplines, and it formed a foundation of 7 fundamental ways of yoga, forms of yoga. So after some time, those 7 forms of yoga turned into a lot more. Hundreds of variations, hundreds of schools, hundreds of ways. So what ended up happening was Patanjali came in and kind of cleaned, and documented from there. So he did not invent yoga, but he did come in once yoga really took form and rolled, kind of like avalanched out. And so then from there, that's why it is considered contemporary yoga. These aphorisms are moksha sastras, spiritual sciences, treatises that trace man's evolution from physical and mental bondage towards sovereignty, ultimate freedom. And that's precisely it. And so that within itself is yoga. And so we spoke about renunciation and non-attachment earlier. Let's continue to build on that. Clearly, the fluctuating mind lures the seer outwards towards pastures of pleasure and valleys of pain, where enticement inevitably gives rise to attachment. When mind starts to drag the seer, as if by a stout rope, from the seat of being towards the gratification of appetite, only renunciation can intervene and save the sadhaka by cutting the rope. So we see from Sutras 1.1 and 1.4 the interdependence from the very beginning of practice and renunciation, without which practice will not bear fruit. How many times have you seen that happen in your life? You go and you clear yourself out only to put yourself back into situations that will energetically drain you. And that's just one example. So many different afflictions going on. So many different stimuli going on. So many different paths you can go on. And all of those paths that the collective are on, none of them are their own path. They've all been paved there for them, like literally and figuratively, of course. You stay on those paved paths too long, you'll never even get to the starting line of your own path. And so when I was a nurse, because we want to talk a little bit about how we can approach this and what it would look like for ourselves. And this is a pretty simple example. When I was a nurse, I had to learn how to quickly detach myself from patients. If you don't, you're not going to be able to treat your patient. So you can actually lose your ability to help someone if you are attached. Now, attached to what? Attached to the outcome? Attached to the person that you're treating as an individual? Or is it attached to your own emotions and past experiences? And that's the thing. It's very tricky. It works its way in all those different versions. And is also, so attached to a fear that you have for your own self as well. And so you learn that you know, if you really want to help someone, you can't freak out, you can't cry in front of them, you can't run out of the room, you can't form this emotional like slavery within yourself. And people will start to form a guilt if they even think that they would have to have detachment from a loved one or your patient you're treating. And that's the confusion, and that's the falsehood there. What they're explaining there with the quote I just read is literally it's an ethereal surgery that needs to happen with oneself. You know, you got to go in there into the different compartments and see where the root's coming from and adjust things. And if you can't necessarily pull out the root now, how are you going to adjust things prior to that so that things can work out and clear out? How do you know what your intentions really are? And so in this way, maneuvering one's mind and even just the thought of having to not have this attachment to things and emotions and people and life, and renunciating daily activities that you engage in and all of this, right? So ultimately, what's the fear behind that? What's the lack of drive? What's the confusion? All of that, it is definitely a ethereal surgery that you've got to go in there and, nicely comb through and slice through that and get rid of that and move this around and suture this up. So as I was saying, you can actually hurt your patients if you lose your focus with your emotions, or if you start to invest in your emotions and all of that. So you can actually hurt someone you're trying to help. And the same can go with people in your life. So detachment does not mean you check out completely. It does not mean you have no purpose or you don't have an ability to have a positive impact on people and to have deep, purposeful relationships. Also, detachment from what your senses grasp onto, the attachment to what they perceive the world to be. There is so much more than believing what you see as the ultimate truth. We need to take that completely out. I'll believe it when I see it. That is something that most are operating on. It exists within us all. It's there, but that's what we've really got to fine comb through. But once you start to live beyond that, you start to kind of let go of everything you believe to be real. Not necessarily right away, but fiber by fiber, sutra by sutra. You're no longer anchored into what you've been anchored to. And so you're able to create a different timeline. This is how you create your own timeline. It's the deplugging process. And this takes effort. This takes deleting codes internally. Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to like the video, share the video, or share your comments below. Part 2 will be available very soon, so look out for it in the description below.